webinar. So thank you, Liz. So you will have a, let's see here. You will have access to the recording afterwards. We'll send you a link to the recording for YouTube, and we'll also have the presentations. I have a list of links that I'll be sharing during the webinar, but I will also, you'll have that afterwards. So don't worry, you'll have access to all the materials. So ANJAC's mission, I'm sure many of you are aware that we promote local action to protect and restore New Jersey's natural resources and ensure equitable, healthy communities. Many of you may be memberships, your towns may be memberships. We appreciate your support. And there's more information about membership if you go to the QR code or to the URL. I'd also like to encourage you to check out our resource center, which you can find on our website. We have a lot of, we have brochures, we have games that you can borrow, we have displays that you can borrow, and just let us know if there's anything that you're not finding. Just let us know at info@anjac.org, and we'll see what we can find for you. And I would like to introduce our experts. Today we have Nancy Adams, the mayor of Maplewood, and Paul Kittner, Maplewood's Stormwater Utility Manager. And I'm actually going to, let's see, I'm going to stop sharing because I wrote some notes and then I realized I'm not going to be able to see them at the same time. So I just wanted to say, let's see here. Okay, so I'm really looking forward to today's experts. I spent 24 years living in Maplewood, and about 15 or 20 of those years, I was working with various environmental organizations in town. The Maplewood Climate Initiative, Maplewood Environmental Advisory Committee, Maplewood Green Team, MAPSIMIL, which was a collaboration of Maplewood, South Orange, and Milburn Green Teams, the Essex County Environmental Commission, and more. There's a Rem Party Garden. There are a lot of great organizations in that area doing great work. And once I started working at ANJAC and speaking with other commissions, I realized how privileged I was to work with municipal officials, elected officials, people who wanted to work with the environmental volunteers to promote an environmental agenda and make a positive impact on the environment and the preparedness of that environment. Sometimes a lot of the battle is just getting the engagement of your officials, and that was never the case for us in Maplewood. So I was spoiled. I first met Nancy Adams when she was on the township committee, and she was our environmental advisory committee liaison. She was always a super engaged leader who was always looking for ways to improve our environment. She started off with a big campaign to educate about gas-powered leaf blowers. Long story short, there is now a year-round ban on gas-powered leaf blowers in Maplewood. And I can tell you from a residential perspective, people were pretty pleased with the results. Nancy is now mayor of Maplewood, and Maplewood is yet again a leader on a subject others shy away from, charging a fee for stormwater management services provided. Maplewood passed their ordinance last December, and their first billing cycle started this past summer. I first met Paul Kittner because he was also on the Maplewood Environmental Advisory Committee. We were really lucky on the EAC in Maplewood. We had an elected official, we had the head of DPW, a health officer. Paul is the director of public works and engineering in Maplewood, and now is also the stormwater utility manager. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from both of them about how the rollout went. Nancy will be up first, and she will be discussing what led up to getting the ordinance passed. And then we'll hear from Paul about billing questions, procedures, reactions from the residents and businesses. So thank you both again for sharing your time and expertise with our commissioners. So Nancy, you're up first.
Thanks so much, Sheila. It's always good to see you now that you no longer live in Maplewood. We missed you up here. But I do want to say thanks to ANJAC for all the information, all the work you do in sharing research and information with municipalities, with environmental advisory commissions and committees. It's really important because we can't all do it all. We don't have all the resources. But so of course, I could talk about gas leaf blowers for about 4 hours, but I will just stick to the topic at hand today, which is stormwater utility. So a few years ago, the state allowed municipalities to set up stormwater utility. And I asked our CFO at the time to what that would entail, what that would mean for us to do that in Maplewood. We had Ida, I believe it was, that we had a really lot of flooding, a lot of not
Mhm.
even just flooding so much as rushing water, like really fast, dangerous water, to which we lost one of our residents because of that rushing water. And every year we go through the budget process and we have capital projects. We have an old infrastructure like so many towns in New Jersey. And a lot of them, there's water coming down from higher elevations through a conveyance system that is insufficient for the higher levels of water, the stronger rains that we're getting. So when we do our budget every year, we have the regular operating budget and go by all the departments, and then we have a capital request budget. And what I was concerned about is that these infrastructure improvements that are so necessary for stormwater infrastructure, so that we don't lose any more residents, so that we do our best to take care of the rising climate driven storms, and was I didn't want that funding to be up in the air every year as to whether or not a future governing body would fund stormwater improvements that are so important, and there's so many and they're so expensive. So we talked about doing a stormwater utility where we could have a dedicated fund, much like the open space. We get a separate dedicated fund for open space trust fund. This, however, is billed separately, and just like our sewer, we have joint meeting sewer tax. They're billed together now. And this past summer was our first billing for the stormwater utility. And we also end up contributing out of our general fund, or out of our operational budget, to our stormwater utility for all our impervious surface. So that includes roads and parking lots and things, anything that the municipality owns. But the big difference is that this fund will be dedicated to stormwater related projects and expenses. And that's the big reason we decided to go ahead and do this in Maplewood, so that we could make sure that every year we're dedicating a certain amount of funds and not having to fight over whether it should be this road being paved or some other capital project. It's dedicated to stormwater utility. So that's why the governing body unanimously approved doing this, because we think it's vitally important for the safety of our residents and for the community at large. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our engineer, and I'm in something else too, so I'm going to be on and off this webinar, but I definitely will be here to, hopefully for some Q&As and things like that. So Paul, why don't you go ahead and take over with, and I'll interject if I want to.
That's great. That's great, Mary. And thank you again for such a good introduction here. I mean, I'm going to screen share a slideshow, a brief slideshow presentation we prepared. But to your point, the last 10 years that I've been here, I've noticed climate change, increased flooding events, increased storm events. And, I think all the reasons you listed were reasons to consider a stormwater utility, the dedicated funding source, and not competing with capital funds. So let me screen share this so everyone can see it. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great, wonderful. So I do want to give a special thanks to DEP as well as Arcadis, the company who really put a lot of this together in terms of the stormwater utility. We did apply for funding, as the mayor had indicated, and they were a big part of that push, enabling us to move forward with this feasibility study and ultimately implementing the stormwater utility. So today we're going to talk about the intro and background of a stormwater utility. We're not going to go into too much depth there. We'll talk about rate structures and rate setting and stormwater utilities. That's probably a presentation on its own. I think the goal today is just to, let everyone dip their toes in the water and get an understanding of stormwater utilities. But There's a fair amount of work that was done behind the scenes, obviously, to get all of this. Then we'll talk about credit policy. That alone could be a seminar. Stormwater utility fee examples. I'll provide you some thoughts and examples of how we broke this down. And funding uses and our budget breakdown. That's important because why are we doing this? We have a lot of uses for this funding, and we'll talk about that. And then we'll share some experiences of what we learned and maybe some pitfalls that maybe you could avoid. And afterwards, we'll open it up to question and answer, okay? So really to start, what is a stormwater utility? Everything that we indicated just now, it's a dedicated funding source for stormwater management. It's a way of generating revenues. The state implemented legislation which allowed us to generate revenues, dedicated revenues for the purpose of controlling flooding and stormwater pollutants from entering our water bodies. But it's a lot more than that. It's a means of distributing these costs to our community amongst the users. I mean, you could argue that anyone who has a parcel that has impervious coverage on it is generating some form of runoff, right? If it's impervious. So in theory, we apply these funds and it benefits the community. The legislation that authorizes us to form the utility is NJSA 40A 26B1, and you could look at that offline if you want more information on that. But this was part of the Stormwater and Flood Reduction Act. I also listed some other references that might be helpful, that being the DEP website, but also if you want to find out some quick information, our own website is actually a pretty good resource, and that's listed below. If anyone wants copies of these slides, I'm happy to share them with you. You could there'll be contact information at the end. And if you email me separately, I'm happy to share this with you. I think we talked about the history. I just want to point out one thing, and that is that, Maplewood applied through the grant in October of 22, and it really wasn't until January of 24 where it was actually kicked off the study. And as Sheila indicated before, bills went out this year. So there is a process. It's not overnight. It doesn't happen quickly. And, if you're entertaining going through this, you should know that. Let's talk a little about stormwater utilities. Why do we need them? I think all of us have aging infrastructure. If you're managing a township and you're managing the infrastructure, chances are you have some aging infrastructure. And, trying to bring that up to speed and make that compliant is also very difficult. A lot of the infrastructure is not sized for the 25-year storm event. It's sized maybe for the 1 to 5 year storm event in a lot of townships when you actually do the calculations. So that's a big problem. Regulatory compliance has been increasing. That's obviously difficult as well. There's a lot of cost associated with that. So that's another reason for utility. We talked about flooding and climate change. And really, this is about recognizing stormwater as a resource, as a true utility, just like water, just like electric, gas, etc. We talked about benefits of the fees themselves, dedicated funding source. It's stable. It's a stable revenue for this purpose. Anyone trying to plan for stormwater management through capital, you're probably like me. All right. You have to forecast for next year's budget what you anticipate the problems are going to be. And maybe half the time you get it right, and half the time you're short on funds, or half the time you didn't anticipate X, Y, and Z. And that's why the stormwater utility is so unique, because the money's there for you and it's ready for that purpose. And also the credit policy, we're not going to get deep into that, but that also offers incentives for residents to implement green measures and upgrade their own stormwater facilities, thus reducing the demand on the township's stormwater management. And another unique thing, if you're applying for grants, you can actually use the stormwater utility for that purpose as well, for matching funds. Maplewood is only 4 square miles, but when you break down our infrastructure, even I was surprised. There's all these stormwater inlets and piping and miles and miles of culverts and piping. It's piping really. It's a lot, and you really don't expect it. Some of these bigger townships, you can multiply these numbers by a magnitude, maybe more, because of all the infrastructure. When I looked back, we looked at some of the funding that we've performed in the past, and the numbers really start adding up. And a lot of these projects were born from capital projects. This was taken out of our road program. So if you notice, the amounts weren't overly large, but nonetheless, when you add them up, it starts rising the cost. We'll talk briefly about rate structures and how to set them in the stormwater utilities. So very similar to utility companies, you pay a certain fee for each kilowatt hour you use of electricity, or gas, for example, or sanitation, you pay per trash can, water per 1,000 gallons. You're trying to establish a fair rate for the stormwater utility, and it's fairly loosely defined in the legislation, but it basically says that the fees are going to be based on a fair and equitable approximation of the proportionate contribution of stormwater runoff. Essentially, everybody's going to pay their fair share, and you're going to come up with a system that's fair and equitable. There's different ways of doing this and different models that can be used. There's an impervious area model that's based strictly on impervious area. There's an equivalent residential ERU model. There's a tiered rate structure model. And maybe if, certain communities where it makes sense, there could be a flat rate model, right? For each house, you charge X dollars. And there's a combination model. In Maplewood, because we have so many different types of houses, size lots, different improvements, every house looks different. We couldn't use, for example, a flat rate model. So we actually use a combination of these. But for your town, you just need to make sure that it's accurate, fair, and defensible. Because trust me, you're going to be challenged by residents on this and businesses who are receiving these bills. This is an example of what the state model looks like for impervious coverage. And, there are certain layers of impervious that have been turned on and turned off on this picture. For example, there's roadways you can see in the bottom right, and going across those parcels, there's road surfaces. They should actually be highlighted blue as well. It just so happens this slide did not have that treatment, but they should also be blue, and we'll get into that in a second, okay? This is an example of impervious areas, what they may look like in terms of, what's impervious. Obviously, the red is rooftop areas. The blue is other impervious areas. You have to go by your ordinance. In our ordinance, compacted dirt and stone could be impervious if it's used for storing cars and heavy vehicles. But it's a matter of going back to your ordinance and defining properly what you think impervious coverage is. Here's examples of residential and non-residential. You could see how much it changes by property. It's important to have, obviously we're relying on the state model, but it's important to have accurate data on this. And surprisingly, when we looked at the values and the feedback from residents, the impervious models were accurate. When you look at parcels and you look at impervious coverage for each parcel, you can actually plot them on a graph like this. And over time, you have certain parcels which are, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but they're larger in impervious area. So they're going to wind up on this end of the graph. And other houses had less impervious coverage. They wind up on the left side of the graph. And then you have what's in the center, you have what's considered the median, or, if you're trying to define what one equivalent residential unit is, it's going to be somewhat in the center here. It's the most common. And in the case of Maplewood Township, that one ERU unit is 3,213 square feet. When looking at this, and the mayor touched on equity, we did decide that charging all houses or houses one equivalent residential unit, I don't think it was sensitive enough to certain houses that maybe just had smaller homes and smaller amounts of impervious. So the township actually opted to build one half of an ERU, and that's in the top left, you could see there. Other properties, by the way, all the measurements in the impervious is based on one ERU, and they're actually calculated in fractions of ERU. So, for example, and we round, right? So if the parcel is between 3/4 of an ERU and 1.25 ERU, they get charged one ERU. And you round, if it's between 1.25 ERU and 1.75, for example, you get billed 1.5 ERUs. Okay, so we bill in increments of one half of ERU.
Paul, I'll just add real quickly to that, as you said, to put it in plainer language. We didn't want houses that were in the more densely populated neighborhoods that have may have a higher percentage of impervious surface by virtue of the fact that they have smaller lots. And so we wanted to make sure that we weren't overburdening those who had actually less land and therefore can't help but have impervious surface, the driveway, the house, the garage. So I just wanted to add that that was the equity issue that you were referring to.
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, and that was a big issue, and we talked about it publicly in many meetings. So I'm happy we did that. Thank you. So these are just examples of rounding, ERUs. If one ERU is 3,213 square feet, right? One half of an ERU would be half of that approximately, right? So if I'm looking at 0.72 ERUs, because it doesn't hit, if we go back to that graph, it doesn't hit the 0.75 mark, right? Because of that, it's going to get rounded down to one half of an ERU, okay? At the same token, if you're at 1.4 ERUs, you're above the 1.25 ERU limit on the graph. So you would be billed 1.5 ERUs. And this process is good because it increases equity by reducing the charge for over 1,300 residential units. That's the one half ERU. So that is something that really pushed. It's exactly what the mayor said. We wanted equity in our township, and I think this model reflects that. When you actually plot on a map the ERUs, okay, you could see on this map here the breakdown, right? So green is one half of an ERU, light green is one ERU, and then yellow is 1.5 ERUs. And you could see that breakdown, how it looks graphically in our, or pictorially in our township. So in terms of setting rates, we'll keep it simple for now. I think, you're looking at what is the overall stormwater project cost, the program cost. And you're looking at how many ERUs there are to actually share that cost. So if you take the total cost, divide that by the total ERUs, you get what's the stormwater fee. Okay. Now, in this model, to keep the math simple, we just threw, simple numbers up here. $1 million of program costs. That's not, extravagant for most towns to spend on, stormwater problems. 10,000 ERUs. So 1 million divided by 10,000 ERUs, you get an average value of $100 per ERU. In the case of our township, we didn't have quite as much program costs, and we had more ERUs to share. So our value was actually less. It was $70 per ERU. That's what we charged. So what are the factors when you're setting these rates? There's certainly a number of them. It's the number of ERUs, how the cost will be allocated, and the rate. You have a growth rate, which can increase over time, and you have a collection rate. There is a delinquency that we factor into these calculations of about 5%. What is delinquency? It's the people who don't pay their bills. It's the agency that maybe doesn't recognize the fee and doesn't pay it. Okay, that's what the delinquency rate would be. And then you have your collection rate, you have credits. All right, we'll talk about credits in a little bit. And you have a fee from the state, which is 5% of the amount, which pays for the stormwater utility and flood reduction fund deduction. So, and then what does it pay for? Well, you have various expenses. So the stormwater utility pays for operating expenses, billing, etc., personnel, maintenance, your renewal expenses, and of course, your capital improvement projects. That's what this pays for. So when we were setting up this model, if you look on the bottom, stormwater activities already addressed through funding programs. We didn't want to include leaf collection and street sweeping, inlet cleaning, and regulatory compliance in our stormwater utility. Your township may be different, and maybe that's a significant portion that's not currently covered under capital planning. But these are expenses that we already factor into our budget process. So we didn't have a need to include those. What we're focused on are the top portions, which are pipe repairs, system renewal, which is really proactive rehabilitation, and capital improvement. This graph is technically not correct because this is just as an example that doesn't have the proper rate and the proper number of ERUs. But I left it in here just to demonstrate an example, and that is you have annual revenue here, what you're expecting to fund, and you have your rate. So obviously it's what you have to establish is this curve to what is the proper curve, and it's based on a number of factors. But really the bottom line is as you increase your rate, okay, and you slide down this curve, you're going to increase more funding, right? That's really the whole purpose of this. A lot of towns, I think Maplewood was the second utility to implement second municipality, excuse me, to implement a stormwater utility. New Brunswick was the first one, and I think Raritan is also in the process of implementing. But if you go just across our border to Pennsylvania, they have 74 utilities, and their range of the fee ranges from $24 to $240. The average is $93. I'll talk briefly about the credit policy. So the enabling legislation requires us provide credits for properties that meet standards that reduce, retain, or treat stormwater runoff on site. And we did have a number of properties here in the township that meet that standard. So when you counter that, you can't just assess them a fee and you're done. They have a right to be able to present to the township, look, we have a detention basin, we have an infiltration trench, we have a rain barrel. And these are measures that are actually defined in our credit manuals. So those could actually reduce the stormwater fee for a particular parcel. But the onus is on them to apply, and the onus is on them to actually request the credits, and my office would review the request and provide a decision on that. I think the benefit to the credit policy is that they pay the user fee, the ratepayers, and it's equitable. it also encourages people to retrofit their properties and do the right thing with green technology. But there's obviously some setbacks with this. It increases complexity of the credit calculations. And, if you have too many of them, which has not been the case with Maplewood, but if you have too many requests, you can actually affect your revenue stream. Has not been the case with Maplewood. Want to talk about some examples briefly of, how the fee is assessed, right? So these are just typical residential properties, right? And a lot of these maybe are slightly bigger than 1 ERU. This is 2.55 ERUs. This gets rounded to 2.5, and that's the fee, $175, based on $70 per ERU. And you could go through these examples, right? 1.48 ERUs, it gets rounded to 1.5. They have to pay annually, one time per year, $105. Here's an interesting example. This is a condominium complex in our township. And if you look at the total ERUs, it's 16. So the annual fee is $1,120 and there's 92 units. So each unit would pay, for example, a little over $12. Here's another example. At the bottom of the page is our town hall building. And amazingly, we have 17 ERUs for that property. It's a pretty large parcel. That's $11.90. And yes, we bill ourselves. The township pays for our own impervious coverage. We pay for coverage in the parks. We pay for our streets. Okay, we actually have to bill ourselves, charge ourselves a bill, and we pay that. Okay, but we also, if you have state roads, you would send a bill to the state. If you had county roads, you would send a bill to the county for their impervious as well. Again, more examples. I'm trying to contrast different densities and different types of properties you may encounter. All right. At the end of the day, you're trying to reduce this to how many ERUs does that parcel have? And what is the corresponding fee? So in terms of funding uses and the budget breakdown, why are we doing this? I think that's maybe one of the most important questions. Our township has a pretty long list of stormwater improvements that we have to fund in the future, right? I hate to say this, but this is just my opinion. Climate change, I feel, caught a lot of municipalities in a bad spot. It came up pretty quickly over the last decade, and a lot of our systems are undersized to handle it. So these are some of the costs that, some of which we're actually working on, and some of these we're planning on doing. Okay. Now, we'll get into this a little more, but the fee itself, generates a certain amount of money each year. And I think from this slide, I just want you to understand the public wants to see improvements and they want to see projects. If you had, for example, this $4 million project, Kendall Ave drainage improvements, that may not be a good use of the stormwater utility fee just because it would take so many years for us at our rate to actually collect that money. That might be a better capital project. So there should be an internal discussion when you look at all of your projects to see which ones are really suitable for a stormwater utility and which ones should still be capitally planned. In our case, the stormwater utility is an enterprise fund, and essentially it's paid for through the user fees. Contrary to popular belief, it's technically not a tax, it's a fee, but it can only be used for stormwater expenses. When you look at our billings, this year we sent out $975,000 of billings. And the breakdown is, as you could read below, right? The township roads and properties, that's a big part of it, was $295,000. County roads, $28,000. We don't have any state highways to deal with. And all the other properties were $652,000. When you look at the revenue after you peel off delinquency and the state payment, we have a gross operating revenue of $880,000, and that could be further broken down into planned expenses. These are capital improvements, and also our fund balance. So I'm not an economist, I'm not a finance guy, but there is a fund balance that's required in this program. So, or it's really needed. And if you plan for, let's say, $760,000 of improvements, but you only spend, for example, $500,000, that extra $260,000 will be added to the fund balance. So you could grow your fund balance over time. And if you had a big project, such as that $4 million job or a $1 million project, you in theory could pay for it with the utility if you allowed your fund balance to grow. We'll talk briefly about some of our experiences and some of the pitfalls. First of all, I think you should have shovel-ready projects. We did have some shovel-ready projects, but not for the full amount of the expected balance. So prior to implementing the utility, you should really focus on having shovel-ready projects. We did receive many requests for credit applications. It's definitely under 50 as of now. It does take some time to process them, and it has not hurt our revenue stream, but it's something to consider. We included the stormwater utility bills when we sent out our sewer bill, and I got quite a few phone calls on, well, what is this new expense that we have, this new bill? And I had to explain it to our residents and property owners. Prior to rolling out the stormwater utility, you definitely want to brief your staff members before launching it, so that, okay, if somebody calls town hall, they know how to direct the phone call to me, for example, or to the mayor, or to finance, all right, or to administration. So everybody, the whole town has to really be briefed on, the stormwater utility itself. The other thing is, when you do set it up, we did have some specific projects that we were working on, so we allocated funds for that, the way it was set up. But you also want to allocate enough miscellaneous and general line items in the utility so that you don't pigeonhole and paint yourself into a corner. That's here. The other thing is, I think, and I got a lot of help through this. It wasn't just me performing this lift. It was my staff, it was administration, it was so many different members of our township. You want to update your website and provide links to residents to get more information. If you go on the township website, you'll see plenty of links that residents can actually go to and educate themselves on what this is. I think it answered a lot of the questions that we normally would have gotten otherwise. And the other thing is, again, the credit policy, we didn't get too deep into it, but there's all different types of credit you could ask for. We referenced the stormwater BMPs because we felt it was, under those rules, those are known standards and practices that were accepted in the industry. I suppose you can make up your own, but there should be a sound basis for that. And the other thing is, we were just getting ours delivered now. There should be a construction sign. Just as a general rule of thumb, it's good to advertise to residents, look, we're implementing this stormwater funding. We know that it was, there's a fee associated with this, but this is what we're working on. And hang that sign out at the construction site so people could see it firsthand. So we can entertain questions. Here's my contact information and the mayor's contact information. If you want to email us separately, call us, you can certainly do that if you have questions.
Yep. Thanks, Paul. We definitely have a few questions that have popped up. I'll start reading some of them to you now. Sean asked if Maplewood has had lawsuits against implementing the stormwater utility, and if so, how did you prevail?
So losses. I think that is referring to maybe delinquency. Is that what they're asking? And
She said lawsuits.
oh, lawsuits.
Have you been
Oh, I'm
sued?
sorry, I didn't
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, it sounded like, yeah.
Okay, so no, we have not received a lawsuit yet from the stormwater utility. I think a lot of that you could stem just by talking to the residents and the merchant owners and just explaining to them the process and why we're doing this. And we have breakdowns of every parcel of how much impervious coverage they have. And I essentially say to them, look, if you think it's different, then show me a survey or some type of document that's reliable and we'll reconsider this. You could apply for credit.
That's
And
great.
at the end of the day, it's $70 a charge per resident. Not too many people are willing to entertain a lawsuit on that basis.
Yeah, correct. Absolutely. Dana had asked if regulatory compliance included the updated MS4 permit compliance.
So you can charge, I believe you can charge regulatory costs and incurred from the township to implement the new MS4, for example, the mapping. Okay, you could charge the utility for that, and you can pay for those costs with the utility, as far as I know. It is utility itself is fairly general. If you needed, for example, a staff member to process stormwater applications and manage the stormwater in the township, you could actually pay for the entire salary or a portion of the salary with that. Um, it's pretty flexible, but yes, I think you could pay for those fees to make it compliant. That's part of the process. That's part of the cost.
Terrific. Virginia wanted to know, when you do condos, do you bill the individual condo owners or do you bill the HOA?
Well, that's really up to the township and how you set up the bills. I gave an example where we billed individuals, but depending on the township you live in, it really depends on how your tax assessor, assesses the individual fees. And I believe in our case, each individual person got a sewer bill, so as a result, we billed them directly.
Right. Somebody had asked about where the funds came for the properties that Maplewood owns, and then somebody followed up with, does that mean you're going to have to increase taxes to cover Maplewood's paying their own stormwater utility?
Yeah, these are all good questions. So we knew roughly what the amount was going to be, and we did build that into our capital budget. So the answer is yes, to a certain extent, you are billing yourself for it. This came actually after the fact, and I think the state looked at their own regulations and decided that this was the proper course on, complying with the legislation. So you do in fact have to do that, but the fund itself pays for itself, and it generates a lot more revenue than what you're paying.
Good, good, good. Oh, somebody asked if you have any instances where runoff from properties in another municipality impacted the stormwater management for you, and therefore, how are you able to, if any way?
So look, these are all great questions. There's no mechanism for us to charge a surrounding municipality the fee itself. So if a parcel is receiving that runoff, in theory, they're allowed to pass that runoff through their parcel. But that parcel's not getting, the parcel that's in Maplewood, that parcel would get a credit unless they had some type of improvement that was defined in the credit policy that we can give them credit for. So even though they're receiving runoff from an outside township, right, it would literally just pass through their parcel. They're not getting a credit for that runoff, and they're also not being charged for that runoff. They're being charged
Right.
for their impervious coverage.
For their own impervious, right?
Correct.
Richard wanted to know, are there any sites in your town that don't pay a fee because they retain all their stormwater? I mean, anybody have zero?
So the whole credit policy is probably its own seminar, but the most you can get out of the largest reduction you can get from our credit, I believe, is 40%. because if you look at any one measure, that's the biggest reduction that we permit. So you're still going to pay at a minimum, a certain fee, but it's the most you can request is 40%. So, but to my knowledge, I can't recall any one parcel that received the full 40%. Most of them are 30%, 25%, et cetera.
And I do understand that you can apply for credit in a couple of years, like if you put a rain garden in or a rain barrel, there's no time limit on when you can ask for a credit, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You can, look, the reality is when you look at the economics, it's probably not economically feasible to implement a stormwater measure to save enough money to, it'll actually self-liquidate or self-pay for itself. But I think there's a lot of residents we have that just want to do the right thing. They want green technologies, and they want to reduce runoff, and they want to be part of the solution. And in those instances, yeah, I mean, if they buy a house and it doesn't have any, facilities that would invoke a credit, they could install it themselves. My only concern is it might cost them more money than the credit itself that they're getting. It may take many years to pay it back.
Got it. Well, thank you. Sean wanted to know, have you been successful in getting the state and county to pay their ERUs apportioned?
Actually, I don't want to get too in depth about this, but we have not received the county's equivalent user fee yet. No,
All
that's
right.
an ongoing thing.
Got it. Sheila, I think there are some in the Q&A. You want to read some of those?
Yes. So let's see, we had a follow-up from Dana, who'd been asking about MS4. Let's see, where was that? I'm sorry, I'm like getting, I'll go back. She's got another question. So she's thanking you for a great presentation. Loves the idea about the construction sign. I also do. That sounded great. It's a great communication tool. Can you talk about the stakeholder engagement process that you had during the feasibility study and how you went about introducing the idea to the community?
Sure. So in Maplewood Township, reaching out to our stakeholders is extremely important. I think that's one thing that we've really prided ourselves on. So we had meetings at the township committee level. We have a newsletter, which we discussed and actually advertised in our newsletter. We brought this up in the environmental commission meeting, which a lot of people attend, Sheila, as you know. A lot of the public watch that. And there were other ways we've reached out to the residents. The communication is probably one of the most important things that you can undertake and move forward with, because that's going to stem a lot of your questions and concerns. The better job you do as a township communicating to the residents, you're going to receive less questions as a result. And I think that's really important. So these are all very good questions and points that are being brought up right now.
So the follow-up question that I was looking for was regarding regulatory compliance. And she was wondering if, she said, you said regulatory compliance was not included in Maplewood's utility program cost estimates, and she's wondering if they included the MS4 in your program.
We did not include the MS4 in this particular program. We actually did receive some grant funding for that, and we already, prior to us setting up the utility, we already really had a functioning map. We had budgeted some extra costs in that, but that was prior to us setting up the utility. So in your case, if you're still looking to fund that, if you could consider that in your utility costs. It was a timing thing for us, and we weren't able to implement it.
Okay, thank you. We have a question here. Do you have dedicated staff for the utility, or is it shared time from DPW?
So, well, I manage the engineering department and DPW, and so far right now, the engineering department's been able to manage all of the credit applications and the requests. We've been managing that. In terms of some of the improvements, DPW has also provided some of that relief. and it's a shared service basically between us, right? Engineering works closely with DPW, but we've been able to do it in-house without having to hire anyone else. Now, if you're a large township or you have a lot of impervious, I mean, New York City, for example, would probably have to hire some people, right? Not to pick on New York City, could be any major city, right? But it depends on how big your town is.
So we have a question that's related to that. Someone's saying they live in a large township, Cherry Hill, New Jersey. And she's wondering, is it easier to implement in a small town?
Well, obviously, with the small town, you generally have, it's really more of a question of how many residents and lots do you have, right? So we have in our town roughly 25,500 residents. All right, and I want to say our lot count was around 9,000. I think in terms of ERUs, we had well over 10,000 ERUs, but I want to say it's about eight to 9,000 in terms of houses. So if you have some towns have very large lots, and some towns are farmland, so you may not have as many residential units to deal with. I think it depends on how many residential properties you have and commercial properties. That's going to dictate, how difficult or easy it is to implement this.
All right. So let's see, what else do we have here? Someone's saying they understand that payments into the stormwater utility are through fees, but the funds for payments by the municipality are raised through taxes. Is it not true that residents and others are assessed municipal taxes to cover the municipality's fees?
I would say that's a true point. I can't refute that. I mean, we used we built it into our capital funds. Now, whether that was changed from our finance department and whether administration made changes to that in terms of the funding, I don't know. But I believe my understanding of the way it was funded, our portion was through the capital funding, through our capital budget.
Thank you. And then we have someone asking, does Maplewood have any CSO areas? And if so, how did you include that footprint in the utility? CSO, so that's combined sewer overflow, which we do not. Right.
We don't have combined
separate
sewers in our township, and I don't want to talk out of ignorance. I don't know for sure, but I would think that if the utility was combined, then in theory you should, and if you had a repair to make, in theory you should be able to use a portion of the utility to pay for that. Now, whether you can charge the full amount, I don't know. I don't know how you would apportion the cost if you even had to, based on cost and flow, et cetera. I'm not quite sure how to answer that, but I would think a portion of that cost could be shared.
Thank you. So I have a question here. I don't know if you're familiar with this or how. I'll just ask you. Have you let commercial property owners know about the new CPACE program from NJEDA, from the the Economic Development Association? Commercial property owners and developers have the right to build stormwater infrastructure using highly beneficial financing. So,
it's not something that I spearheaded or engaged in, but it's not to say someone else from our township didn't do that. I can't speak on that aspect, but it's possible someone else did, but I did not know.
And then someone's asking about staffing. So do you allocate part of the cost to the utility fee and deduct from the town general budget?
So in our case, I'm not covering any of our personnel costs. I'm not using the utility for that purpose. I could, and in theory you could, but I think it was one of the slides I showed previously. That's one of the costs that we decided to just keep as it was, and that was already built in as one of our operating expenses in our budget. So we didn't include that as part of the utility. But certainly, if you had to hire someone, or you really thought that this was going to entertain a large portion of one of your existing staff's time, you could bill that time and you could charge their cost.
Right. So have you considered revenue anticipation bonds backed from stormwater utility fees to address some of the largest projects?
It's not something that we've anticipated, but that's interesting. I'd like to look more into that.
And here's a question, I think it might be early days for this one, but have you seen your runoff decrease since implementing the program? And how do you measure or impact, or how do you measure the impact or demonstrate the value of the program?
So, so we have implemented some stormwater management improvements, and that has the effect of reducing runoff. But I think the question is it appreciable, and can you recognize it? And I would say not yet.
Right.
Our township was deep in a hole in terms of our stormwater conveyances being undersized. It's going to take many years for us to climb out of that hole.
All right, Liz, do you have anything else?
No, I think we've covered most of it. This has been terrific.
This has been really wonderful. Thank you,
yeah.
Paul. And
It's my pleasure.
thanks
My
to
pleasure.
Nancy.
I know Nancy's gone, but thank you. That was really terrific and a lot of information. And we could tell the attendees are really wanting to enjoy the information you've shared. We're going to keep the webinar open for a few more minutes so that people can grab some of the links and et cetera. But if you want, whenever you want to leave, you can just